Hello and welcome back to the YouTube studio here at the Munich Security Conference. I'm Jack Kelly from TLDR News, and I'm joined by Dr. Comfort Arrow, the President of the International Crisis Group.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
The International Crisis Group has a mission to prevent wars, shape policies to build a more peaceful world. But looking at the conflicts surrounding us around the world at the moment, things like Gaza, Ukraine, Myanmar, Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and many others, it looks like it must be one of the most challenging times in your organization's history. Is that true? And is that how it feels within the organization?
Yeah, 2024 is a particularly worrisome year. You've just listed a number of conflicts that we're dealing with. There's a lot more one could have listed. They all formed our 10 conflicts to watch. There's a sense in which, if you look from 2012 onwards, that wars are rising, the humanitarian toll, the casualties, the number of civilians caught at the crossfire, everything going in the wrong direction, whether it's Ukraine or Gaza. I would add Ethiopia to the list, and then you've got the entire Sahel. So, we've been, particularly from the period of the Arab Spring, Libya, Yemen, there's a sense and also in Nagorno-Karabakh, there's a sense in which diplomacy doesn't have the same influence or leverage. There's a sense in which leaders prefer to fight it out, to use military power as opposed to diplomacy as a tool. There's a sense in which the numbers are just going in the wrong direction, and that there are no more sort of constraints, no guardrails to prevent or avert. And the business of peacemaking itself appears to have lost its currency or taken a real knock-on effect, because leaders see that a victor's peace has more weight than going to the table to make deals to stop war from continuing as well. So it's a worrying moment across the international spectrum. No region is untouched by what we're seeing right now. So, for Crisis Group, nearly 30 years on, if you're asking me to look at the entire span of our 3 decades, and if I was to pinpoint any other period, I think the Arab Spring period, I think post 9/11, the war and terror, were pretty bleak moments, but this is the bleakest that I've seen it in my time at Crisis Group as well.
You've mentioned a number of factors already, but do you have an assessment of why we're facing so many crises around the world and so many conflicts around the world at the moment? And what do you think the biggest obstacle for peace actually is?
Yeah, look, for Crisis Group, it's always context specifics, but nonetheless, you can sort of extract some few expressions and stand above everything and come up with a sort of a narrative to explain why things appear to be what they are. And I think one thing is very clear to us this year is just the nature of global politics as well, where, as I said, leaders see there are no guardrails. The tools that we use to prevent, avert, to do peacemaking are in a crisis themselves. The multilateralism, the UN itself, often seen as a last port of quarter, or where leaders do speak through the Security Council. The Council itself is very dysfunctional. Major power competition. There's a preference for more aggressive response as opposed to giving diplomacy a chance. And I think there's also mistrust of the systems of the international architecture. It doesn't seem to have the same weight, gravitas, ability to shape or direct diplomacy. And where it is happening, it's for things like humanitarian assistance. It's for humanitarian pauses. It's for prisoner exchanges. That's not to say that those aren't important, but the hard work, the political work that you need to make a deal, to negotiate, to get leaders at the table, and that's becoming more difficult, more high stakes because of geopolitics, because of major power competition, whether it's the West and Russia, whether it's US-China tensions, and of course you've got rising middle powers, assertive powers, who are not at one level they're complicating the picture. You know, they have different sets of views about how to resolve a conflict, but they themselves are also restraining the ability of a number of, you know, classic traditional actors and have a view in terms of how conflicts should be resolved, whether it's in Sudan, for example, as you're watching, you mentioned Gaza at the very beginning, or in terms of Yemen or Myanmar, they also have a stake, and that makes it harder to get to making deals as well.
You mentioned Sudan. Yesterday you were on a panel discussing the war in Sudan, and one of the other panelists described it not as a forgotten crisis, but as a willfully ignored crisis.
Yeah, and complacency.
Yeah, I was wondering if you agreed with that assessment, and if you do, I'm curious why you think it is that some wars and conflicts attract so much attention and resources while others go ignored.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's certain facts you can't obviously ignore. There's certain conflicts that do have significant international repercussions. Ukraine, and the fallout was quite significant in terms of sanctions and what it meant for energy prices and what it meant for food security, for example, in Africa as well. And we're seeing it in Gaza, you know, trying to avert a regional escalation. You're seeing now what is happening on the Red Sea with the Houthis as well. So there are some conflicts that do have an outsized implications. You can't ignore that. I wouldn't put Sudan in the category of the forgotten conflicts. I would put, as a speaker yesterday said it, and by the way, it was the UNICEF, the Children's Fund, who said it, and it was I would actually go one step further and say it's willful complacency as well, because the international community championed the revolution of 2019. A number of sort of regional and international actors were guarantors of trying to shape that process as well. But the hard work of supporting the civilian regime to help it figure out what a peace dividend would be, especially at the time of the pandemic, especially when there were a number of economic wins that needed to be made, especially when you had a real sort of deep civilian casualties and just a number of crises, both within Sudan and the region. That's when it was necessary for international actors to stay the course, to play the long game, to be patient with it. Because what were you asking Sudan to do back in 2019? You were asking the civilians who had an uneven hand to work alongside the military, which had a higher hand. You know, the military had all the leverage in their hand, you know, the revenue of the country, the economics, the money was still in the hand, and the civilians were having to do the harder work of the peace dividends. And the international community never stayed the course. They got impatient. And of course, when you have another big conflict like you had in Ukraine, inevitably bandwidth and capacity and the political ability to stay there becomes harder. So I don't think it was necessarily that Sudan was knocked off. There's also a sense of which, you know, would we expend our political capital here? But I wouldn't put we should also be careful about what we define as the international community. There are many players in Sudan. There's the region, you know, which wants to play, insists that it takes the lead, i.e. the Africa Union. There's a degree of complacency there, which is that you don't stay there and do the hard work. There's a wider region which has a view, i.e. the Red Sea, both on either side, the Gulf countries, they have a view. They all have their views on what stability ought to look like as well, and none of them doing the hard work of defining and helping to shape Sudan out of that crisis as well. So I agree with what was said yesterday. I'd even be a little bit firmer on what has been lost as a result of that complacency as well.
Another region you've mentioned already is the Sahel, particularly on the west, when we've seen a series of coups in places like Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Guinea. And it seems so far that the regional bloc of ECOWAS has been relatively unable to handle these crises, with even more resilient democracies like Senegal currently in crisis over their postponed election. I'm curious what you think can be done to prevent further democratic decline in this region.
Yeah. I mean, it's unfortunate because for me, the poster child of peace and security, architecture on the continent, the regional body that really sort of was playing a forward-leaning role in terms of conflict prevention, in terms of peacemaking, peacekeeping, in terms of the democratic resilience that you were talking about was the West Africa ECOWAS. And right now, I think it's in a state of peril, a state of crisis itself. The rejection of the three Sahelian countries of external players it's not just about the West. It's not just about France. It also extends to ECOWAS. And when you ask those three leaders, what was the heart of their decision to reject ECOWAS, they argue that it's because ECOWAS was not fulfilling their aspirations. Now, you can question that, but I think it says a lot that, of the 15 member states, 3 of them rejected ECOWAS as well. Now, for me, I think this is a wake-up call for ECOWAS. I do think that it needs to get to grips with the region. The region of 20 years ago that everybody champions is not the region of today. There are multiple regions in the region. The Sahel are now creating a bloc for themselves. A bloc that is sending a message both to the region, but the international community, that we have a sense of the direction that we want to take. Nobody knows what that direction looks like. They've created an alliance for themselves. They're very clear about pushing back against any form of external intervention that extends into the region as well. And it's a very sovereigntist agenda. And they're looking at the international landscape at one level, keeping the door open to say we'll still do business with you, but on our own terms. But we need to understand what those terms are. Now, on Senegal specifically, it's true. And this is sort of one of the chief bastions of democracy in the region. But as I speak to you, in the week of the Munich Security Conference, a significant development took place, which is that the Constitutional Court, a significant institution in the country, rejected what the president was doing. So for me, that's important. And so democracy is not all lost, regardless of what leaders are trying to do. I think the people themselves in Senegal are not happy with President Macky Sall's own decision. The court has spoken up. We will see what happens next. But for a region where there has been a very vibrant approach to democratization, this is a moment of introspection. But one of the other key countries across the coastline, Nigeria, remains the engine room of democracy, even if there are multiple challenges, even if there are questions about, how well homed in democracy is. If that goes, then I think we really are in trouble, and that hasn't been lost. And one more point, I worked in Liberia for the UN mission, and a critical election just took place last year there, when George Weah actually handed power over to the next president. So while we look at all these other turbulences, there are some glimmers of hope that leave me with a degree of optimism that we haven't lost it completely in West Africa.
Absolutely. One of the key themes of the MSC report this year is the idea of lose-lose, the concept that we're heading towards a more zero-sum game when it comes to geopolitics, and the art of cooperation is being lost to some extent. Do you agree? Do you think that's an accurate assessment? And if so, what does that mean for the important work that organisations like yours are doing in mediation, peace building and peacekeeping? Yeah, I mean,
quite frankly, Crisis Group was hardwired for this, because we operate in the realm of the reality. Of course, we aspire for a better world. We have ideals. When we're shaping our policy, there's the ideal, but we have to deal with the reality as well. And there's a degree of pragmatism in our approach. That this is the politics, this is the hand that we've dealt with, and it's a sense in which you've got to muddle through. What is the goal? What is the end game here? It's about finding a sustainable approach to peace, and when peace is crafted and signed in pencil, then it's not going to last long. When you have this kind of like pay-as-you-go approach to peacemaking, then also it's not going to last. I think what worries me a lot is that we haven't seen a viable peace settlement for a long time. For example, I think the last meaningful one was in Colombia in 2016, and before that was in southern Philippines as well. So yes, there's a sense in which we are in a zero-sum game. But this is why I say that we've got to find a way in which to bring that crafting back of diplomacy. It's a long game, it's a hard game, it's a patient game. And as much as you aspire to the ideal, you have to deal with the reality. There's a a degree of elite packed in. We
Yeah.
want this war to stop. You want the fighting to stop. The very first people you have to deal with in that situation are the warring factions. You know, you have to bring them to the table and figure out what their incentives is, cajole them, urge them, understand who's influencing them, who's given them fuel, and try to figure out a pathway through that. I don't think you can ignore that, especially when you define the world as a zero-sum game as well.
We have less than a minute left, but quickly to finish off, we've asked a lot of our interviewees this, but I'm curious that amid the world's crises, do you have a cause for optimism? Are there examples of positive developments you can point towards at the moment?
Absolutely. I mean, number one, in our 10 conflicts to watch, we also outline opportunities. But look, what have we seen in the last few months or years? The rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, very crucial to have seen that. The elections in Guatemala, but everybody like making sure that those who were trying to usurp the president's inauguration, that went ahead as well. So those are two sort of important factors. And despite everything that's going wrong, whether it's in Somalia or the DRC as well, that there is a sense, among citizens as well, that they have a sense of the direction in which they want to go. So a lot of citizens now speaking up in defense of democracy, in defense of democratization. And for me, that still gives me hope that citizens themselves, despite what their leaders are doing, still want to see democracy flourishing as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Dr. Comfort Ari, thank you so much for your time. It's been great speaking with you.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure. Thank you.